Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
So on 29th November, Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the British Labour Party, undertook, or some might say resumed, a reshuffle of shadow cabinet positions in the Union Parliament. Whether this was a planned refresh post-conference or just the completion of the aborted and widely perceived as botched reshuffle earlier in the year is a question for debate. What can be said is that it was a bad day for the Welsh PLP, another bad day for the leader-deputy leader relations and the soft left and left-leaning members of the Labour parties of England, Scotland and Wales. The upsides are somewhat less clear. Fortunately, here at Hiraeth, we have an expert on Labour Party politics with us. So we're going to be firing some questions at Matt.
Hi, Rich.
So, Matt, was this the reshuffle that Starmer wanted to do back in May, when he tried to demote Angela Rayner and make a whole raft of changes and it all went terribly wrong? Or is this a whole new reshuffle for this moment in time?
I think it's a little of column A and a little of column B. I think that the reshuffle that he tried to do before and sort of botched, where he tried to reduce the amount of people in the shadow cabinet and as a consequence, reduce the amount of SPADs that we have backing up the shadow cabinet because we are broke as a political party, was failed. It was botched because he couldn't get the first move past Angela Rayner. I think there are certain people in this reshuffle that wouldn't have been promoted in the previous one. So I don't know whether everyone would find it a little bit helpful to just give a sort of overview of what happened, Rich. So Yvette Cooper has become Shadow Home Secretary, replacing Nick Thomas-Simmons, who now goes to International Trade. David Lammy has become Shadow Foreign Secretary, replacing Lisa Nandy, who has gone to Levelling Up. Wes Streeting has become Shadow Health Secretary, replacing Jonathan Ashworth, who goes through the DWP. Bridget Phillipson has gone to Shadow Education, replacing Kate Green. Peter Kyle has gone to Shadow Northern Ireland, replacing Lou Haig, who has gone to Transport. Pat McFadden is now Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Steve Reid is now Shadow Justice Secretary, who replaces David Lammy. Joe Stevens is Shadow Wales, who replaces Nia Griffith. Lucy Powell has become Shadow Culture, who replaces Joe Stevens. Jonathan Reynolds has become Shadow Business, taking some of the responsibilities that Ed Miliband used to have in his role. Ed Miliband is now Shadow Climate Change and Net Zero Secretary, a job that doesn't exist, but we won't get into why Labour creates jobs that don't have an equivalent in government. As I said, Lou Haig now Transport. Emily Thornberry has become Shadow Attorney General when she was Shadow International Trade. And Jim McMahon has gone from Transport to being Shadow DEFRA.
And surprise our audience, who's Shadow Scotland Secretary now?
Ian Murray.
It was a shock, isn't it?
Well, during the Corbyn years, we definitely had people as Shadow Scotland Secretary who weren't Scottish MPs. But I think that Keir has decided that he's going to use the benefit of having his only Scottish MP be his Shadow Scotland Secretary, of course, backed up by Ogmore's MP, Chris Elmore, as the Deputy Minister in that team.
Obviously. So you mentioned then that there are a number of people that got promoted this time that maybe wouldn't have been promoted in May, maybe because their trajectory, their political trajectory wasn't quite right, or their experience wasn't quite right. Who do you think falls into that camp of the list that you've just read out?
I don't know whether Yvette Cooper was ready to come back at that point. I think there was an attempt made to get her to come back into the fold at that point, and I don't think it worked. And this is why we've now got this situation where Yvette has come back, leaving the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee now vacant. I mean, a lot of these are sort of sideways moves. A lot of them could have been done at the time. You think of things like John Ashworth going to DWP.
That surprised me. I thought he'd been one of the better, performers in the previous Shadow Cabinet because, quite frankly, there wasn't much competition in that particular regard. But he did at least seem to master his brief, and he was quite a good media performer for the Labour Party. Surprised me that they moved him, but I guess that's what happens when you need to get new rising stars like Wes Streeting and Bridget Phillipson into the Shadow Cabinet. Do you think that this has all been helped in a way by Boris Johnson, perhaps? I was thinking that the sticking point for me before, when I was thinking about the previous reshuffle, was Lisa Nandy, who I think is too important, has too much of a constituency as a former leadership contender for the Labour Party, someone who has an awful lot of support, represents a very key kind of constituency in the north of England. I think almost Boris maybe helped Keir out by creating this weird department of levelling up out of the local government department, because that kind of feels just about important enough so that going from Foreign Secretary to Shadow Secretary of State for levelling up, I can barely even say it with a straight face. It just feels like there's not many other places where she could go.
Yeah, and a very interesting point made by Stephen Bush on the New Statesman podcast about this reshuffle was that Shadow Foreign Secretary is essentially Shadow Minister for going on the telly, because Shadow Foreign Policy is decided by the leader of the party. Shadow levelling up seems like a very good place for Lisa Nandy to be. You know, she can talk about her work on improving the prospects of towns and is now shadowing Michael Gove. And she seems like a very good opponent for someone like Michael Gove at the dispatch box, who is, you know, for all his many criticisms, is very good performer at the dispatch box. So someone like Lisa is a very good opponent there. And yeah, I think that if it had just been a move to sort of communities, housing and local government, it wouldn't have felt as important. It would have felt like a very significant demotion. One that I think has actually not been talked about a huge amount by the media is how much of a demotion that is, but she seems still quite happy to be around the big table.
Absolutely. So while we're on the subject of quoting former or very nearly former New Statesman journalists, let's lean into Patrick Maguire's now infamous tweet that Joe Stevens has been demoted to Wales. It was a bad reshuffle for members of the Welsh PLP, wasn't it? Including, of course, not only Nick Thomas-Symonds, but also for the rather entertainingly nicknamed, we discover, NATO Nia Griffiths, who was the previous Shadow Secretary of State for Wales, but also former Shadow Defence Secretary, and where she did profess her love for NATO on a regular basis, much to the disgruntlement of the Corbyn flavour of Labour that was in the ascendancy at the time. Was it really that bad for the Welsh PLP? And what does the role of Shadow Secretary of State for Wales have in store for Cardiff Central MP Joe Stevens?
Well, I was thinking, Rich, the only real question of this reshuffle is whether Keir seems to dislike the left of the party more or less than he dislikes the Welsh part of the PLP. So Nick was obviously demoted from Shadow Home Secretary. He had, for all his many, many qualities as a thinker, as a speaker, as a politician, he hadn't performed very well in that role. Joe, yes, it's very interesting to see whether that is a demotion, isn't it, really? And I think that massively depends on what you think you can do with that role as Shadow Wales Secretary. I mean, it will give her a significantly larger role within the party in Wales. She's very close to Keir. It could be a very good move for Wales, for Welsh Labour's influence within the UK party. She's a much more dynamic figure than Nia. I think it could be good for the Welsh PLP to have someone like Joe in charge. With regards to Nia being sacked from the Shadow Cabinet, I mean, Nia is an incredibly loyal foot soldier. I mean, Nia is not pro-Trident, but in her role as Shadow Defence Secretary, had to toe the party line on that, which now has her being nicknamed Nuclear Nia or NATO Nia. I mean, I'm not sure on view on NATO. She may well be a fan of NATO. But she was just a loyal member of the Shadow Cabinet who didn't want to break collective responsibility at a time when everyone was sort of nod, winking to Labour's anti-NATO, anti-nuclear policy position. That wasn't actually the policy position. So she just did what every member of the Shadow Cabinet should have done, really.
Just thinking back to that Shadow Secretary of State question, and we know this from having recently recorded, though not yet published tellingly, a whole series of interviews about the St David's Day Agreement. The Labour Party used to be in the same position as the Conservative Party is today, where whether shadow or government position, the Secretary of State role always outranked the leader of the respective Senedd groups. In the Labour Party side now, that has been well and truly settled. There's no doubting that the First Minister of Wales or the leader of Welsh Labour in the Senedd outranks, the Shadow Secretary of State or Secretary of State if they're Labour in Wales. Not the case in the Conservatives. But does this mean that the role is, as many people in the Senedd seem to believe, superfluous? And is one of the acts of the next Labour government going to be to abolish the Secretary of State role for the territorial offices?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, that, isn't it? How do you operate when a large amount of your Senate colleagues want your prospective role to be abolished? I think that the major issue for Labour, if they wanted to abolish the territorial offices, which I don't think they do, is that does leave you open to accusations from nationalist parties that you no longer care about those areas. So I don't think they'll be doing that, especially with the way that Keir Starmer would probably use someone like Ian Murray in government.
Does it mean, though, we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the Conservative Party in government, and generally with regards to the UK government. I think when we did our Unionists and the Union in Trouble episode last year, do you get the impression from the way that both the Conservative benches are composed and also now the shadow benches in the Labour Party are composed, it looks increasingly difficult that someone from Wales or Scotland would be able to hold one of the major ministries of state and or be Prime Minister?
Oh, I don't think we'll ever see a Welsh or Scottish Prime Minister ever again. Not one that holds a seat in Wales or Scotland, anyway. Because I think that there would be too much of a narrative from the UK press that they weren't suitable. And you saw with Kinnock the way that he was constantly undermined. And I think in a post-devolution political landscape, i.e. one where realistically a Welsh or Scottish Labour MP who became leader of the opposition, who became potentially Prime Minister, wouldn't be able to, or would be taking decisions for a country they don't represent in the health service, in terms of education, in terms of huge heaps of government spending. So if you look at it from that media aspect, where I think that someone from Wales or Scotland would be either undermined or belittled because of their status as being a Welsh or Scottish MP, that's one thing. But then there's also the fact that they would be taking decisions on something that didn't matter to them. I think this is, of course, a clear contrast to people like Liam Fox, for example, who is a Scottish MP but represents an English constituency.
Yeah, similarly, Robert Buckland recently in government, and Michael Gove, etc. Do you think the parties have internalised that then when they do these reshuffles, or because it's not being said explicitly, obviously for obvious reasons, but at the same time they seem to be internally just making these decisions as leadership teams that they're just not going to risk it, and I wonder what that means potentially for the future career paths of aspiring. Let's be honest about it. There are a number of Labour MPs in particular from Wales who aspire to be government ministers. If not Prime Minister, but the path to that while they continue to represent a Welsh constituency seems pretty tricky, if not impossible.
I think it's important to be very clear about this, though, Rich, that this is a reshuffle that feels like it's been designed by the blue ticks on Twitter. It's about who does the press think are the best communicators. That's why you've got people like Yvette Cooper in the top jobs. And I think that it's not really a question of talent, I don't think, with the Welsh PLP and their positions within the shadow cabinet at a Westminster level, because they're just not high profile enough. The only high profile Welsh Labour MP that is not in this shadow cabinet is Chris Bryant, really. Anyone else with any real clout is there. And if you were thinking about your prospects of being a minister in government, for example, if that's what you really cared about, you'd try and become an MS, wouldn't you, if you were a Labour Party politician, because the chances of being in government are far higher. And some cynics may say that we've already seen people who have been previously MPs look at the prospects of Labour in Westminster and decided to move down to the Senedd because it increased their chances of being a member of a government.
Yeah, or likewise Manchester, of course, elsewhere.
Of course.
You're absolutely right, though, about Chris Bryant. He's an interesting outlier, of course, because what he really obviously wants is the speakership of the House. And he seems to be carving out a niche for himself, but he's never going to be in government. Even if there was a Labour government, he wouldn't be a minister appointee for anything, would he, in all likelihood?
I don't dare go into the mind of Keir Starmer, sadly, Rich.
So you mentioned this earlier, Matt. So the left of the party might not be feeling particularly great about this reshuffle. And you also mentioned then, which is becoming the dominant, I think, kind of journalistic analysis of this reshuffle, that Keir was rewarding people who have cut through, if we can use that rather gross phrase. So is this a reshuffle to make the shadow front bench more aligned with what you would perceive as the centre or right of the Labour Party? Or is this a reshuffle to try and bring people in who have that mystical cut-through quality?
I would consider this a blundered consolidation of power by the Labour right, which is somehow equally disastrous and irrelevant in a way that only Keir Starmer can really master. So there's been a significant increase of people on the right of the party in senior positions. So key members of the Labour right, people like Wes Streeting, Peter Kyle, Pat McFadden, being promoted to quite senior jobs. There's also there's significant wins for people like Rachel Reeves by taking part of Ed Miliband's job off him, taking the business aspect of his title means that they can stop him talking about the nationalisation of key industries, etc. So things like that are very clearly, it's very clear why they've done things like that in order to, and it very much suits the economic narrative that Keir is trying to create. It certainly suits the way that Rachel Reeves wants to operate. That to me is pretty obviously what happened here.
The thing about that, and I think this is something that what we've had in a way, I think about the last few years, is that Labour has tried a whole variety of different things against quite a shifting target in terms of political opposition in Westminster. So obviously there was the kind of soft left, Miliband-led rejection of New Labour, and that obviously didn't work against David Cameron. Then there was the Corbyn experiment, if you can put it in those terms, and that managed to lose twice. Once, obviously, against a pretty awful, electorally against a pretty awful campaign and leader in the form of Theresa May, but it did better than expected. And then it did exactly as expected against a far more potent campaign as led by Boris Johnson. And now there's Keir Starmer there. And I wonder if, much as the left of the party might feel that this is a betrayal or a kind of straying from a successful, or some of the successful shoots of the Corbyn period, maybe the reality is that to win in England, which is where Starmer needs to win, you need to be a different party. You need to be a more of a centre-right party, because in my lifetime, the only Labour Party that has ever won in England has been the party of Blair and New Labour. And maybe that's just a recognition of the hard truth that Scotland appears to be largely gone and out of reach for Labour. Wales still continues to support Labour, although with a different flavour. And where Starmer has to win is England, and maybe the kind of centrist approach is maybe where the electorate is in England. What other routes are there?
When stuff like this is asked, Rich, I'm reminded of two great Labour lefties. So there's and I'm going to butcher these quotes, but Tony Benn always said that Labour is like a bird. It needs two wings to fly. It needs both wings to fly. And then Roger Morgan once asked, do one-legged ducks swim in circles? Well, at the moment, the Labour Party feels sort of like a one-winged crow flapping about, but not really moving anywhere. You ask whether this right or sort of centrist to centre-right version of the Labour Party is a better electoral prospect. But the reality is that yesterday, Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of the Unite trade union, said that the Unite would be cutting its political funding for the Labour Party. And to put that amount of money into context, Rich, in 2019-20, Unite gave £7 million to the Labour Party. Now, that is a significant dent to any electoral war chest. If they don't have that money, if they lose the backing of the trade unions, I don't care what your policies are, you're not going to have the money to fight the election. Now, maybe they'll start getting support from business now, but I think that things like losing the backing of Unite are so important to the mentality of the party. Not only are the trade unions the bank of the Labour Party, the Labour Party exists to facilitate trade unionism. It's not the other way around. The Labour Party was formed by trade unions. And to see the trade unions move so rapidly and so powerfully away from the Labour Party like this, it's really worrying, not only from a financial perspective, but from a moral one too.
So this kind of really gets to the kind of core of the matter for me. And I think we all saw this both in this reshuffle and much more notably in the previous one. Isn't that two wings analogy exactly what the whole point of having a leader and a deputy leader is about? When Blair was leader, Blair was the modernising, more centrist, more pro-business wing. And then we had John Prescott, who was the left-leaning, rabble-rousing, punch you in the face if you throw an egg at me kind of trade unionist wing. And between them, they managed to keep the birds more or less in the air. In fact, they took it higher than pretty much any Labour party has been on this island for decades. However, at the moment, we've got this apparently terrible situation where you have someone who very clearly comes from a hinterland that would appeal to the left of the Labour Party in Angela Rayner in the deputy leadership role. And if that relationship was harmonious with Keir, you would have thought that they'd be able to, she would be able to appeal to one major constituency and he would be able to appeal to the other. But he seems to be doing everything possible to kind of demoralize her, undermine her, and because of the timing of these reshuffles, widely perceived the first one was to try and pin some of the blame for the loss of Hartlepool on her, and this one, the reshuffle was timed apparently to coincide with a major speech, although I think that's kind of slightly oversold in the coverage. But if they could remedy that relationship, then wouldn't that be the winning thing? And why is it they're not able to do that?
Very interesting. You say that Angela is John Prescott, Keir Starmer's Tony Blair.
I think the record will show that's not what I said. I was drawing a loose analogy. But
a loose analogy. Let me draw a loose analogy. I mean, for all his many, many flaws, Keir Starmer is not Tony Blair. Tony Blair was an exceptional communicator who, had his hand on the concept of what the UK wanted politically. And it doesn't take a great oracle to see that's not quite where Keir Starmer is. Now, to me, I think that Keir has taken every opportunity to sideline Angela because he's fearful of a challenge from Angela, because if she'd run for leader when he did, she'd have won. And to me, I think that explains so much of why he acts the way he does to Angela.
Is it kind of like it's almost an acknowledgement that he knows he's in a weak position and that he doesn't command the respect of his party in a way that perhaps some of his predecessors have?
Well, he won that leadership election on the first round. He absolutely has a mandate to lead, and I'm of the opinion that it was wrong to challenge Jeremy Corbyn for the leadership of the Labour Party at the time where it was done.
Which time it was done, Matt?
The 2016 time, just after the referendum. I think that was the wrong thing to do. And I'm not advocating anybody else challenging Keir Starmer. But I do think that if he was challenged, it would be a much harder time for him now. And look, I think the membership of the Labour Party has drastically changed since his election. I think there are fewer people on the left of the Labour Party, who would have been on the left of the Labour Party, who are now still members of the Labour Party. I think that is obvious, but I think it's very important to note that the average Labour Party member is to the left of this shadow cabinet and will not be very happy, if they pay attention at all, with the makeup of this shadow cabinet. It feels to me like Keir is taking a calculated gamble that people on the left will vote for Labour at the next general election no matter what. And that's a very big gamble, especially with things like the climate crisis raging on. People focus on that. I think you could see an awful lot of, and I'm not advocating this, by the way, I think you could see a significant amount of people say, I'm not bothering with Labour next time. I'll either stay at home or I'll vote for a small party on the left. And they won't win because they'll need everybody to come together. Their voter coalition needs to be as broad as possible. And I'm not advocating that needs to be coming straight from the left like Jeremy Corbyn did, which obviously didn't work. And I'm not talking about being on the right either, because I think that the best way that Labour wins is by keeping that coalition together. And you don't keep the coalition together by doing what it feels like is deliberately winding one side up. And that's what it feels like Keir Starmer is doing at the moment.
So just leading into final thoughts now, I was just thinking to myself, obviously the last question that I had, which I think I may have picked up on your answer to it, but I'll ask it anyway. Does this reshuffle leave the Labour Party in a good place to fight the 2023 or 24 general election? And will Starmer ever be Prime Minister of the UK?
Events, dear boy, events. Who knows where Labour will be in May 2023 when the next general election is likely to happen? It's very, very difficult to say, because you could make a very good argument to say that this shadow cabinet puts you in a much better media position in terms of taking the fight to the Tories on policy, etc., on narrative. But if the relationship between Keir and the left, Keir and the trade unions continues to sour, then we would really struggle to fight an election, because you just won't have the money to do it. And you need, like I said, as broad a coalition as possible. You need people energized and enthused to vote for you. And I don't get the impression that people are hopeful. And I don't get the impression that people feel like Keir can win. And even people I know who voted for Keir whenever that leadership election was, it feels like it's been years and simultaneously a couple of weeks, whenever that was, they're not impressed with him either. He hasn't been able to grasp the narrative, to command the attention of the British people. So to me, it's very hard to see Keir Starmer ever becoming Prime Minister, but who knows, really?
I've got to ask a very quick one. Do you think that he has an ideology? Because, Blair had an ideology, Corbyn obviously had an ideology, Miliband had a pretty identifiable ideology, but it's very difficult to pin Starmer down, isn't it?
I think, now, don't get me wrong, I think he has politics. I think he has a clear set of values and ideas and policies he would like to implement. I think he lacks a lot of the political maneuverability skills of other former Labour leaders, because he's not been in it as long. He's quite green to politics, really, although he's been involved in politics his entire life. He hadn't, until the last 5 or so years, been heavily involved in the sort of top level of how to operate in politics. One concern I do have is statements that he's made saying he would break promises to become electable. And I think we've clearly seen that from the pledges he made to become leader of the Labour Party, he's been happy to break them when it is advantageous. Like I discussed earlier, things on common ownership, basically telling Ed Miliband to shut up about nationalisation. So he's the leader of the Labour Party. Of course, he has politics, but whether he has the determination to see those put in place, that's a much bigger question for a very different day.
Well, if people haven't had enough over this short pod of your grumpy trade unionist complaints about Keir Starmer, where can they find you on Twitter, Matt?
They can find me at Hexter101, Hexter 101.
Great, and you can find more from Hiraeth at Hiraeth Blog Cymru on Medium and Facebook, and at Hiraeth Blog on Twitter.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.